Okay, hello and welcome to our panel discussion celebrating 60 years of human spaceflight. I'm Brian Odom, I'm the acting NASA Chief Historian, and I'll be the moderator for today's exciting discussion that I hope will add a valuable historical context for that celebration as we're talking about that today and going through that. Just a very exciting time. So 60 years ago today at exactly 9:34 a.m., Alan Shepard became the first American to fly in space on Freedom 7 capsule launched by a Mecury-Redstone launch vehicle. Just 23 days prior to that event, however, the Soviet Union had scored yet another impressive achievement, launching the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space on an orbital flight. Shepard's flight, while suborbital and lasting only just over 15 minutes, was really enough to convince President Kennedy to commit tremendous resources to the Apollo program, a program which would land humans on the moon and return them safely to Earth. In the 60 years since Alan Shepard's Freedom 7 flight, we've landed humans on the moon, made over 200 spacewalks, and fostered international collaboration with 15 countries to build and operate the International Space Station, where 244 people have lived and worked conducting investigations for more than 3,000 scientists, researchers, and educators over more than 20 years. So 2 decades we've had people living in orbit above our heads here. Talk about human spaceflight. Today, NASA and our international and commercial partners are continuing the mission of human spaceflight with commercial crew, which we've seen just so much activity there over the last year. I mean, it's just been an incredible feat, one right after another. Splashdown at night recently, beautiful. And the Artemis program. With the Artemis program, NASA will land the first woman and first person of color on the moon using innovative technologies to explore more of the lunar surface than we've ever done before going on to Mars. We historians don't really spend a whole lot of time living in the future and contemplating what's going to come. We're busy enough looking back. We're barely in the present most of the time. But I'm definitely just every day at NASA, we're all excited, just as the public is, with all of these incredible feats that continue to happen. And we're really excited to see what happens over the next 60 years of human spaceflight. And now, just to go ahead and kick off our panel today, what I hope will be a great discussion, I'm going to introduce our panelists here. First off, in no particular order, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony. Teasel is the curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the author of the recently released Operation Moonglow, A Political History of Project Apollo. Next, Dr. Bill Berry, retired as NASA's chief historian in July of last year and is now an independent historian. His 1996 doctoral dissertation was a political history of the early Soviet human spaceflight program that led to him working with NASA when he retired from the Air Force in 2001. Up next, Dr. Margaret Wiedekamp, the chair of the Department of Space History and the curator for the Social and Cultural History of Spaceflight collection. She is the author of Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, a history of a short-lived private project testing women pilots for possible astronaut fitness in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And finally, Kathy Leaders. Kathy is the first woman to be named Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, where her key function is to manage the full human spaceflight portfolio, which again is something you see every day, these impressive feats that are coming. So let's start by going back to the very beginning, right? The reason we're here today, how this all got kicked off. Start with Teasel. Teasel, if you could just take us back to 1961. I mean, again, as historians, it's so important that we convey this historical context. So tell us a little about the beginnings of human spaceflight. What was going on in the country there and in the world at the time, and what were some of the big challenges?
Sure. So I'll take us back to 1958 when Project Mercury was first announced. And so at the very beginning, the establishment of NASA, they announced this human spaceflight program. And it was somewhat sort of subsumed from an Air Force human spaceflight program, Man in Space Soonest. And the objective was relatively basic at the time. It was to orbit a human around the Earth and then determine whether or not they could function well in space and then recover them successfully. So relatively straightforward. And the astronaut class was announced in 1959. This was the Mercury 7. They were they were all people who had background in military. They had a minimum requirement of flight time. Many of them far surpassed that. They all had to be less than 5'11", and they also had to have degrees in physical sciences or engineering. And so this is a class of 7 people selected from about 500 people. It was a huge sensation when the news was announced in this press conference. They became celebrities instantly. People were so fascinated by them and their lives, and it was really clear that human spaceflight would draw a lot of attention for the American space program. And then you have the first American human spaceflight with Alan Shepard's flight in May of 1961. There had been earlier test missions that tested the hardware and also sent animals into space. There was some concern after a flight of Ham, a chimpanzee, in January of that year. And so the timeline was somewhat delayed. And I think it's also worth noting this political context of human spaceflight. And at this time, the Eisenhower administration was somewhat interested in human spaceflight, but skeptical of any kind of large-scale space program. And so when Eisenhower was presented with information about the cost of sending humans to the moon, he thought it was far too expensive and should not be a national priority. President Kennedy, as he was becoming president in '61, was also presented with this information. He had a transition team that looked into the future of human spaceflight. He also was somewhat skeptical, and he pushed off the decision till the fall. He didn't think it made sense to really prioritize it at that time. He himself, he wasn't terribly interested in spaceflight. He had other priorities when he became president, but things very quickly changed, especially with the flight of Yuri Gagarin in April of 1961, and this really just completely changed the trajectory of the American space program. So the Soviet Union successfully launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit. It was a huge global phenomenon. People around the world were paying attention. It made newspaper headlines, and analysis that was given to President Kennedy suggested that, well, the launch of Sputnik in 1957 really shocked the world, which was significant. Gagarin's flight impressed them. And this is a moment when you're in the Cold War, and the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for global influence, and they wanted to win the hearts and minds of the world. They wanted to win alignment from other countries. There was a huge number of newly independent nations with the end of colonialism. And so the expectation was that space flight was going to be really essential for winning these alliances and also shaping the political and social trajectory of these countries. So trying to convince people to choose communism or democracy. And so Kennedy was quite concerned, and he was someone who was very attuned to public opinion. And then a few days after Gagarin's flight, you have the failure at the Bay of Pigs, which was a CIA-backed invasion. And it became very clear to Kennedy that the United States had to do something to regain this international prestige, international standing. And so he asked his advisors to find him a space program that promises dramatic results we can win. He charged Vice President Lyndon Johnson with that goal. Johnson met with all the experts at the time, and he also met with members of Congress to ensure that whatever program they selected was going to get congressional support and funding, which is very essential. And then they came up with the objective of sending humans to the moon, landing them, and returning them safely back to Earth. And that objective, there's the technical rationale and there's the political rationale for that. So the technical rationale is that with that type of objective, both the Soviet Union and the United States were going to have to build new rockets, and then it somewhat levels the playing field in a way. And then political objective is this idea that it is men and not machines that ignite the imagination, capture the imagination of the world. And because Kennedy was pursuing a very highly impressive space program to win the hearts and minds of the world, that was essential. And so he decided on the Apollo objective of sending humans to the moon. But it was essential that Alan Shepard's flight 60 years ago was a success. Kennedy was pulled out of a National Security Council meeting, and he watched the flight with all the others around on a small television in his secretary's office. It was a success, and so he was able to follow through with the Apollo program, which he announced on May 25th of 1961. And so much change at this time, and I'm going to go through it really quickly because we have a whole panel of many years to cover. But the Apollo program really initiated just a huge growth at NASA. So an increase of personnel. You have, by the mid-1960s, over 400,000 people working on the program across the country and across the world. Over 90% of those are working as contractors and subcontractors. It's worth noting a very small percentage of them are women and minorities in this period. Only 2 to 3% of technicians and engineers at NASA at the time were women. The United States had to build huge new hardware. So the Saturn V rocket, new spacecraft like the lunar module and the command module. It could go on and on and on, and develop new techniques, which was important for the creation of Project Gemini, which was the second human spaceflight program of the United States, which would send 2 astronauts into space at a time. There were 10 missions in total that were crewed, and what they did is they tested rendezvous and docking and long-duration spaceflight. One of those missions lasted 2 weeks, which this information was essential for traveling to the moon, especially with the approach that was chosen for the moon lunar orbit rendezvous. We can go into that more if there's interest. And then you have the Apollo missions, starting with Apollo 7 as the first crewed mission in the fall of 1968. The United States sent humans on an orbital flight around the moon first in December of 1968. And those first lunar landing was July of 1969. And the last time the United States sent humans to the moon was in 1972. There were additional astronaut classes recruited throughout this time. Some of the criteria changed, and so over time they lessened the required number of flight hours and increased the criteria for education and increased the height limit as well, and decreased the age limit too. But what you still have with all the astronauts, American astronauts in this period, they're all white men who have significant backgrounds as pilots. And then after the Apollo program, Nixon really changes the trajectory of the American space program. He doesn't think that human spaceflight should be the national priority or the highest national priority. It should be one of many national priorities. And so he shifts the attention. He pursued the shuttle program, which we'll talk a bit about more. I believe Margaret will speak about that. But there was also the Apollo applications program, which used some of the Apollo hardware, including the Skylab mission. So this was an American space station, and it had 3 crewed missions. And then also importantly, the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. And this was a joint mission with the Soviet Union, and American astronauts trained with Soviet cosmonauts and had a joint mission in space in 1975. And I think I've run out of time. There's so much more to say, but I'm sure we will continue the discussion later on.
No, Teasel, the degree of difficulty there is, just so many impressive things to go through. But I think one of the key things, the big takeaways for me just then was and we could talk about this later, but, the importance of presidential leadership, the importance of, from an international perspective, right? The Soviet Union, who had accomplished Sputnik, right? The great first of Sputnik, and then the great first of Yuri Gagarin. Tell us a little about what the view from the Soviet Union was like.
Yeah, well, things were really different over in the Soviet Union, and part of the challenge for those of us in the West was that we didn't really know what was going on there. But the big question was, how did they do this? Right? The Soviet Union was largely seen as a backward country. They've been, not particularly well developed in the early turn of the century. They were ruled by harsh central authority, first the czars, and then after the revolution in 1917, the Communist Party. It had this wacky Communist Party ideology that said that the world would inevitably become, led by communism, and that the Western capitalist model and democracy would go, by the wayside, and that they would make sure that happened. So this is guaranteed, confrontation with the Western world, and on top of all that stuff, the accomplishments in space are really impressive because the Soviet Union had suffered so much destruction in World War II. The country was largely leveled, and so they're just recovering from that in 1957. A dozen years after the war ends. They're still trying to get basic human needs and housing stock built back up, and they launched the first satellite into space. And everybody's like, how the heck did they do this? They clearly put a huge effort into building nuclear weapons because they built the first nuclear bomb and the H-bomb shortly after the United States had succeeded in doing that. So that was an impressive accomplishment. But then just a couple of years later to be first in space, and then to continue being first in space with a series of these accomplishments. First satellite, the first living creature in space, like the dog, just a month after the first satellite, first probe to the moon, first pictures of the far side of the moon, you name it, they came up with the first that succeeded and made it happen. So this is a really strange thing for most people in the West to wrap their minds around about what was going on and how did they make this happen. So the Soviet government's explanation was it's because of their ideology. Communism was clearly the wave of the future, and so we would, of course, we're first in space because we're better than the United States and our system of government's better, and that goes to all those countries that Teasel mentioned, all those newly independent countries. Many of them needed to develop quickly too, and they thought, well, maybe the Soviets know something nobody else does about how to develop quickly. Clearly, they're beating the West in space. But while that was what the Soviet government explanation was, we now know, of course, that one of the main reasons why they were successful in space is because they had a really small, highly nimble, extremely dedicated, and very good team of engineers and scientists led by a guy named Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, who was their genius behind their space program, and who was kept secret, by the way. The Soviets said they were keeping him secret to protect him from assassination by the West. In reality, I think they kept him secret because they didn't want him getting too much authority and the ability to speak out on his own, because he was really dedicated to space and not so much into developing missiles and military systems. And that was not what the government needed. In fact, one of the problems the Soviets had was that they really had suffered heavily in World War II, and they had very limited resources. And so the Communist Party leadership is trying to make itself look like it's ahead, so they dedicate effort to the space program and to achieving these firsts. And meanwhile, they try and balance the other things. So Korolev and his team are kept under a pretty tight leash, and they generally only got approval to do projects that they were interested in doing as a result of them making the argument that if we do this, we can beat the Americans and it'll make us look good. And Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, he loved that. He thought that was great. That was a way to keep America in its place, and protect his country, and to make the appeal of communist ideology stronger around the world. So they had a very dedicated system where they would watch what the United States was doing, because of course we operated in the open, and it was easy to find out what we're doing, and they'd identify things that they could do that they thought they could beat the United States in. They had the advantage of having not only Korolev and his incredible team, but they also had a really large launch vehicle, what's known as the R-7. The modified versions of it, now known as the Soyuz launch vehicle. It's the same basic launch vehicle, was used for Sputnik and Gagarin, and we still use it to launch humans into space. So they had that launch vehicle, and they had the advantage of watching what the United States was doing. So they'd pick and choose things to concentrate their efforts on to beat the United States. The first satellite was one of those things, the first dog in space, first pictures of the moon on the far side. Those sorts of things were easy to do. In reality, the Soviet space program, for all of its propaganda value, was really pretty thin, particularly compared to the United States, where we were busy building, astronomical research satellites and spy satellites and communication satellites and navigation satellites. They weren't doing hardly any of that because they didn't have the resources to do it. They were focusing their space program on first. And of course, when the United States announced the Mecury-7, in the early ages, the Soviets, of course, immediately identified that's something we need to beat the United States in. They go out and secretly recruit a group of cosmonauts that they then train for flight. Yuri Gagarin gets selected in part not only because certain technical capabilities, but also because he fit the mold of being a good communist. His family had grown up as peasants. And his family had suffered in World War II under German occupation. So there were all these things. He was also incredibly good looking and charming, and it was a natural hit. So that's part of the reason why Gagarin goes first. And to some extent, they got lucky that the United States was slow off the mark with the flight of Alan Shepard, with the delay that happened that Teasel mentioned. But also they were planning to exceed what the United States was doing anyway by going, instead of a suborbital flight like Alan Shepard did 60 years ago today, they went directly to a full orbital flight. And they use this kind of thing to their advantage a lot. For example, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, the decision to launch a woman into space happens not coincidentally, I would suggest, because the United States was busy arguing about should we have women in the astronaut corps. And within a year, the Soviets, they didn't have a whole lot of new technology that they could demonstrate in 1963, but they needed to fly something in space. And so their way to make they flew basically the same mission they'd flown a year before with 2 spacecraft, but one of those spacecraft included the first woman in space. And so they set a record there. Very valuable propaganda. They used the racial disharmony in the United States and the civil rights movement in the United States as a propaganda tool, as well as the space race, and to try and demonstrate that their system was better than the U.S. system and a country should follow them. So that had a huge, huge effect. Unfortunately for Chairman Khrushchev, his decision to go all in on beating the United States on things really winds up backfiring on him, because launching Gagarin in April 1961, just 3 weeks before Alan Shepard goes in his flight, and combined with the things that happened with the Kennedy administration that Teasel mentioned, drives President Kennedy to move the goalposts, set a new goal, and up our game, and decide to go to the moon. The Soviets really weren't ready to go to the moon. In fact, they don't make their decision to try and get to the moon until August of 1964, when they started a whole series of programs to try and beat the United States again by getting to the moon before the United States did. By that point, they were pretty far behind, and late start is what probably led them to not succeed in beating the United States to the moon. Although they came pretty close in some ways. But nonetheless, it's really sort of ironic that this human spaceflight thing is seen as a tool for the Soviet leadership to prove that their system is better. And in fact, the effort to prove that they're better winds up causing their main adversary to up the game and make it difficult for them to use that anymore. And there's lots we could talk about this, but I'll leave it at that.
But that's great. But I think you see a lot of the same things Teasel talked about from the Soviet perspective, right? It's political leadership there as well, right? Because when Khrushchev is ousted, it changes things just a bit. It changes the decision-making process, and how interconnected these things are with the world of the 1960s here in America, the civil rights movement and Soviet attempts to take advantage of that. So, Margaret, I get that takes us to you. I mean, if you really, the astronaut corps as it's been laid out, starting kind of with the Mecury-7 here in the early years of this human space flight, definitely very white, definitely very male, as Teasel talked about. What was the early experience of marginalized groups in the space program, and how did that kind of change over time there?
Well, I think there's a famous picture of the Mercury 7, a few actually, where they've lined up in alphabetical order because they looked so similar that was one of the ways to make sure that the captions were done correctly and that the right people were identified. And there's a real way in which, in that moment, that's seen as a sign of excellence, right? As that exclusivity is the emergence of this group at the top of the pyramid that is exclusive in a number of ways, both in terms of skill, but also we know that it was not a very racially integrated, certainly wasn't a gender integrated pyramid. Because when we talk about kind of who's in the group, a lot of times we really want to talk about what's the pipeline, right? What's the set of skills that you have to get to that job. So as Teasel has said, for the astronauts for many years, it really was military jet test flying, especially in that earliest group coming out of President Eisenhower's decision. And that meant that he's buying into a whole system for creating skills that does have some historical exclusion associated with it. After the end of the Women Air Force Service Pilots in 1944, wound down before the end of the war, the military services in the United States do not allow women to fly. So that closes a door for women to have access to the kind of training they would need to be in the pipeline for NASA. And so, in fact, when Randy Lovelace ran a privately funded test program to see whether women could participate in spaceflight, he was envisioning huge orbiting space stations with dozens of people on them. And in some ways, then he's very visionary in terms of human spaceflight. And he's wondering whether women are going to be able to physically take the strain in order to be the secretaries and the telephone operators and the nurses and the support staff. So in some ways, he's very much a product of his time and thinking about what we would call kind of pink collar work, right? Women's occupations. So that door had been closed to women by not having access to military flying. And so the women who went through Lovelace's program privately in 59, 60, 61, really only had built their flying skills through private flying, not through commercial flying and not through military flying. But there's an extraordinary subcommittee hearing in the summer of 1962 in which they actually investigate, is NASA discriminating on the basis of sex? And the conclusion, and John Glenn is a wonderfully articulate spokesman about the time, which was also the beginnings of the second wave of the women's movement in the United States and really in the midst of the civil rights movement, and saying, you know, we would love to be more expansive, but right now we really need to focus on these goals that President Kennedy has set and keeping our standards up. And that means we're going to stick to these very exclusive pipelines. So where we start to switch from manned spaceflight, as it was called at the time, to human spaceflight really comes later in the story. And this is where I kind of pick up on the timeline that Teasel laid out for us so well, which is really with the beginnings of the space shuttle program. You have a split in the kinds of astronauts, both pilot astronauts, but then also the creation of a category called mission specialists. And that's going to be the research scientists who are working in the payload bay and who are doing other experiments on the shuttle, so that you need a commander and a pilot, but now you have room for more different kinds of astronauts. And with that, then you can tap into different pipelines, which are slightly more diverse than what you see in military flying. And I always think it's important when we tell these stories, I want to tell kind of two main points. One is the changes in who's in those pipelines doesn't just happen. It happens because people really agitated for it to happen. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act is really important in terms of racial integration, but also gender. The word women was added to that piece of legislation, and so that's important. We want to look at things like Title IX, which gives, we know often in terms of sports, right, which gives women, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in educational institutions that get federal funding. And so often we see that in terms of sports and athletics, but it also really affected women's ability to get into classrooms and to be a part of postgraduate education. There are lawsuits that allow more women into law schools, medical schools, that allow them into PhD programs. And so when you start in the 1970s looking for people in a pipeline who have PhDs, who have medical degrees, who are top researchers who might be interested in bringing their skills to NASA. Now, all of a sudden, you're looking at a pipeline that has more women, that has more people of color, not because things have just magically gotten better, but because people agitated for real social change, real cultural change, and real legal change that allowed them to participate. So even things like the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which was passed in 1972 but never ratified, it's one of the places where you begin to see that change in military flight training, is actually the military services are interested in getting ahead of that change, right? They don't want to wait for it to be shoved down their throats and have to include women in their training. So they actually, Elmo Zumwalt at the Navy is one of the first to say, you know, we're going to take this on and we're going to integrate women into flight training on our own terms. So we start to see pipelines that are going to be more diverse and are going to allow us to really move towards human spaceflight. And the second part of the story that I want to tell is really that for that 1978 class of shuttle astronauts, as the space shuttle program is being developed, an orbiter that will be reusable, that can have larger crews, both pilot astronauts, but also mission specialists who would be working with satellites, working with experiments, they start thinking about having that face of the astronaut corps, that most public face of human spaceflight, although certainly not all of human spaceflight, as I'm sure Kathy will talk to us about, be a little bit more something. In the 1970s, the exclusivity of the 1950s, which seemed very much a mark of excellence, now seems out of step with the times. They need an astronaut corps that looks like the face of America. And so they open up the program and the recruitment, and what NASA finds when they start digging into the applications for the 1978 class is that not as many women, not as many people of color as they had hoped were applying. And they realize they have a legacy of past discrimination. People know that there have been talented African Americans and Asian Americans and women who have been applying to the astronaut corps through the 1960s and never being considered. They need to go out and recruit. And the story that I always love, which is true, is that when they were starting to think about how do we show a vision of men and women of different races working together on a spaceship, one of the best visions was Star Trek. Right, that television program that was on air from 1966 to 1969 included that vision in part because Gene Roddenberry thought if he put men and women of different races on a spaceship together, clearly this is far, far in the future, right? That immediately sets that setting, but it became a very important symbol. It was something Nichelle Nichols, who was the actress who played Lieutenant Uhura as the African-American communications officer on that bridge crew, was a really important symbol on television because she was someone, an African-American woman in a role that wasn't a maid. And in fact, she had decided to quit the show after the second season, and no less than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked her to stay on the show because he said, if you let that door close, who knows how long it will be before it opens again. So she had gotten interested in actual spaceflight through her role as a crew member for imaginary spaceflight. NASA regularly sent people to talk to space science fiction conventions because they knew there was a lot of overlap there from the imagined and the real in terms of interest and passion. And so actually James Fletcher, the NASA administrator, approached Nichelle Nichols and eventually hired her to do a public relations campaign for NASA in that 1977-78 moment to say, come, we're open, there's space for everyone. And really, that was, in many ways, I think, an important turning point for human spaceflight in terms of the astronaut corps. That recruitment made a real difference. There were over 8,000 applicants for that 1978 class that eventually produced 35 astronaut candidates, 6 of them women, 3 of them African-American men, and 1 Asian-American man. And so with that, you see the beginnings of a change for the most public face of human spaceflight, But these same social, cultural, political changes that have been changing the pipeline for the astronaut corps have been changing the pipeline for the engineering groups, for the life sciences groups. And you're starting to see more diversity, and both in terms of race and in terms of gender. And especially as the space shuttle program matured, as the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, and you start to really look at international space cooperation, then I think you also see increasingly a turn towards that international participation in spaceflight. And so the story of human spaceflight really has its roots in real people agitating for real change outside of NASA, and then also within NASA supporting that change. And I think the legal and social and cultural changes that allowed more diversity in the pipeline has allowed us to see some significant changes in who's doing the flying and also who's on the ground supporting that. So as we celebrate 60 years of human spaceflight, we really are thinking about human spaceflight because we've had women, we've had people of color, we have international participants who are regularly a part of human spaceflight, both in space and on the ground.
Yeah, wonderful. I think you're right. Just this idea of the astronaut corps representing a larger discussion that's taking place in America, right, in the democracy. And as a historian, you see these, my own research in the civil rights movement and kind of its relationship to Apollo. And you see it not only in an astronaut, we don't see ourselves there, African Americans will say, and very publicly, right? We don't see ourselves in this class. We don't see ourselves having avenues or ways to get involved in the space program, either through STEM education or funding for our programs. And that becomes part of that incredible conversation. So yeah, that's a great point. And which I think, definitely leads us to today, right? I mean, so we've built this history, we've talked about the past and, and how it informs what we do today. And Kathy, Margaret just laid this out in an incredible way. So the composition of the astronaut corps today has certainly become much more inclusive, much more diverse and inclusive. Can you tell us a little bit more about the state of the Artemis program and kind of what we're doing now in human space flight, and maybe even talk a little bit about teams, right, and how you think teams actually function in this environment and in this inclusive nature?
Well, I think what's amazing after listening to Teasel and Bill and Margaret is that, a lot of the seeds that were sown in the 60s and the 70s are coming, we're starting to see the bounty now. And I think what's really cool about this is that we're not done, right? And so these lessons that were learned and that we're looking back on and kind of seeing how, presidential influence and direction and how NASA can be a tool for lots of different movements out there is continuing, right? And so I actually think what's really cool about the way NASA is today is, one, we're doing things differently. People ask me a lot about, well, how are we going back to the moon differently? And I'll tell you, we're going back to the moon very differently. I mean, we've taken the lessons that we learned through the 70s, 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and we are now going back to the moon with our international partners. We're going back to the moon with our commercial partners, which is, I would say, another whole new realm. And really changing how we do our missions from one of us doing it and it's a race to how do we include as many people in our nation and in the world in our mission, right? It's about inclusion. How do I get as many people out there involved in our mission? Because this is a mission about humankind, right? And that's a very different mission than what we were doing in the 60s, right? While we're doing the same thing, we really view that us moving out and us solving these big problems is what helps us then as a species be able to solve the big problems that we have for our species. And obviously some of those are, how do we get the most out of every single person that's out there, right? And so we do go intentionally look at our workforce very differently. You know, we've all talked about this at the beginning, and I kind of did a speech where I said, hey, you know, for Halloween, one of my friends showed up as a nerd engineer, and guess what? She could show what that looked like. It had a white lab coat and a pocket protector and a pair of black rimmed glasses. But you know what was really cool about that was that was a 1960s prototype. And nowadays, I don't know what a picture of a nerd engineer would look like. We'd all kind of have our idea of it, but it's lots of different people out there. And when you go, and if I went and showed you a panorama of what engineers look like in all the different space companies and all the companies across the world that are doing space work, you would not find this one image, which is really, really cool. We've got this whole tapestry of a workforce now working to deliver and work on space problems, right? That will help us here on Earth. And so when I listen to the crowd here and I hear about this, I think about here we are 60 years later, and we've used our mission, and the nation's used our mission, and the world's used our mission to really change how we do the mission and do it for really humankind's good, right? And I think that's an amazing story, and we should all be very, very proud of that.
Thank you. That's perfect. You know, how one thing about the Apollo program that I remember, and Teasel has written about this quite a bit, but you know, just the international view of this and what Bill just spoke about, but how people, you know, when the astronauts went on a world tour, you know, they talked about the we did it, and you know, I think that also speaks to that inclusive element, not only, you know, from a race, sex, gender, but from where you are in the world and how you view these accomplishments. I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind. So I think our last virtual panelist here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to do this. Again, I'm a historian, so we'll see how the technology holds up for me. It's always a wonderful thing to do. But I have a pre-recorded video here from Jeanette Epps. Now, if you're not familiar with Jeanette, Jeanette she's assigned to NASA's Boeing Starliner 1 mission to the International Space Station, NASA astronaut, and just an incredibly awesome person. So let me see if I can start this out and see if we can get it going. And I'll share my screen, the wonders of Teams. Here we are. And here we go.
Hello, everyone. I am NASA astronaut Jeanette Epps, and I'm excited to join you virtually to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Americans in Space. As we recognize this incredible milestone, and particularly today, it's easy to remember that Alan Shepard was a first. The first American in space, and the first to return to adoring crowds and parades. Celebrating first is important, but let's also remember that much important work follows the initial breakthroughs. 60 years after NASA's first crewed flight, NASA's mission has expanded, and we're still doing what was once thought impossible. NASA strives to explore space, drive innovation in science and technology, and implement our discoveries to improve our lives here on Earth. The Artemis program represents NASA's next steps in achieving these goals on and around the moon. Landing Artemis generation astronauts on the moon, including the first woman and first person of color, as well as establishing sustainable lunar exploration, are just some of our goals. I'm proud that our astronaut corps is becoming more diverse than ever before, and I know that this will help us achieve even more. Now, of course, landing on the moon isn't easy, even if we've done it before. It requires a common effort and new collaborations. The light has dawned on a second golden era of space exploration, and this is in large part due to our revolutionary teaming with international and commercial partners. Working together with our partners, NASA is now able to launch from American soil, harmonize efforts to make space travel safer and more frequent, as well as fuel new jobs and new technologies. It also allows us to re-engage with the American people and the world in a new and exciting way. Happy 60th anniversary of Americans in Space. Keep your eyes up as we will soon return people to the moon, where we will get ready for our next giant leap, human exploration of Mars. This is Jeanette Upps, NASA astronaut, signing off.
All right. Well, hopefully that played well. I just, it's inspiring to hear Jeanette talk about this. I mean, and I think it's, it's definitely reflective of what we've talked about here, where we are with commercial, international, all of these different partners that we have in a very, very dynamic environment. So I think one way to kind of finish this out, if we want to go back through any last final quick thoughts from anybody, and maybe the order we started, we'll start out with Teasel. Any thoughts about human space flight, where we are today from your standpoint there?
I always think it's important to recognize how compressed this timeline is and how much we've achieved in just a short amount of time. These anniversaries are a great reminder of that it's only been 60 years, and that first flight, although extraordinary for the time, was just a brief 15-minute suborbital flight. So we've come such an incredibly long way, and I think it's a great opportunity to recognize that with the 60th anniversary.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, I'd just say that I think human spaceflight really sort of touches people in an important way, in a way that frankly robotic spaceflight does not, and so I think it's a key factor in our continuing path into the future, that we need to continue to push ahead, and that human spaceflight really sort of epitomizes the best of all it, and we've made a lot of progress. We've got some more progress to make, but we're getting there, and I think this really, in many ways, is an example of what we can do when we work together to achieve great things.
Mark?
Brian, I would just say that I would emphasize those the national institutions, the Smithsonian Institution and the National Air and Space Museum and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I see us really interested in the future of space flight, and I'm excited to be a part of today connecting that to the history. So I'll make the naked plug that the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, where I am right now, just reopened to the public this morning. And if you come and visit, you will be able to see Freedom 7, Alan Shepard spacecraft, right next to Columbia, the Apollo 11 command module that brought Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins back from the moon. And we talk every day about, we're excited about the idea that the next generation of people who are going to go work for Kathy leaders at NASA are walking through our doors and are perhaps inspired by the history that they're getting to see and the technology they're encountering. So I love the connections here and that shared purpose and mission.
Okay.
Hey, we're not done. We're never done, right? That's the key, right? And so we just need to keep working on it. And it's important. I'm not done until I can, get 330 Americans involved in this and the 7 billion people across this world, right? We're not done. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's actually pretty humbling to realize we're all part of this team that has the legacy starting from Alan. So it's actually an amazing thing. Real honor.
Excellent. I think all those points are great. I think, especially people always talk about my job. It must be, and Bill, someone who's had that job, how awesome it is. But Margaret, I think when you were talking about what you can come and see in these institutions and be blown away by the things you get to see on a daily basis it's incredible. So I'll make that shameless plug with you. Visit these sites and see these artifacts. They're incredibly inspiring. Because you don't know where it's going to go. And in that vein, too, I think we'd be kind of remiss if we were talking about human space flight and we didn't mention, we lost Michael Collins and how important Mike was in just talking about not only his participation in human space flight, but his talking about human space flight and kind of creating ways that we could share that with the world. I think that's one of his legacies, one of his most important legacies as well. But well, again, I thank you all for participating here, and I thank everyone for watching. And again, like we started out, and like Kathy said, we're not finished. Keep looking. I mean, if you pay attention right now, there's so much happening in space and human space flight. And one of the things someone told me recently, Bill, was that, you know, the whether robotic versus human, but all space exploration is human space exploration, right? It's all part of the same thing. All right. Well, thank everybody for participating. Thanks everyone to listen and keep an eye out, and we appreciate it. And we're all signing off here. See you soon.
Thank you.